In a small cafe nestled in a tight-knit community, a troubled young man's life is about to change forever. A young man, filled with anger and pain, enters a cafe with nothing but contempt. What happens next is unbelievable. A single woman's quiet kindness sparks a journey of redemption that no one saw coming. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. The sun rose gently over Cedar Grove, a quaint neighborhood where every face was familiar, and every story was shared over back fences or at the corner store. The houses, with their vibrant coats of paint and carefully tended gardens, seemed to lean toward one another like old friends exchanging secrets. At the heart of this little world stood a cozy cafe with lavender shutters and a cheerful yellow awning. The sign above the door read Margaret's Cafe, and for the locals, it was more than just a place for coffee. It was a haven. Margaret, the cafe's owner, moved with the graceful confidence of someone who had seen life's hardships and emerged wiser for them. At 68, her presence was as warm and comforting as the scent of cinnamon rolls that often filled her cafe. Her silver-streaked curls framed a face lined not just with age, but with years of laughter and a few tears. To her community, Margaret was a symbol of strength and generosity. She remembered every patron's name, their favorite order, and often their worries. But Margaret's serene world wasn't without its challenges. Among the townsfolk, whispers often turned to one name, Tommy. At 21, Tommy was a storm that refused to settle. Known for his sharp tongue and confrontational attitude, he had earned himself a reputation as the neighborhood troublemaker. He prowled the streets with a chip on his shoulder, quick to lash out at anyone who dared challenge him. Most avoided him altogether, but Margaret had a habit of offering him a kind smile whenever he passed by her cafe window. The tension in Cedar Grove had grown in recent months, with Tommy's outbursts becoming more frequent and disruptive. Yet, Margaret's cafe remained a neutral ground, untouched by the discord. It was a place where laughter echoed, strangers became friends, and everyone, no matter their troubles, could find a moment's peace. Margaret's calm demeanor had a past that had forged her resilience. She understood pain in ways she rarely shared, her empathy rooted in experiences that were hers alone to carry. It was this quiet understanding that gave her a unique way of dealing with people like Tommy, not with anger or judgment, but with a patience and kindness that often disarmed even the most hardened hearts. The stage was set for a collision of two worlds, one built on compassion and understanding, the other fueled by anger and mistrust. In the warmth of Margaret's cafe, the stories of Cedar Grove were bound to intertwine, and amidst the aroma of fresh-brewed coffee and the hum of quiet conversations, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The morning rush at Margaret's cafe was in full swing. Regulars filled the tables, their voices blending into a comforting hum as coffee cups clinked and plates of warm biscuits were passed around. It was a typical day, one of camaraderie and shared smiles, until the door swung open with a loud jingle of the bell. Tommy strode in, his presence commanding the room in the worst way. Dressed in a rumpled hoodie and scuffed sneakers, he carried himself with an air of defiance, his piercing gaze daring anyone to challenge him. Conversations faltered, and heads turned as he made his way to the counter, his steps heavy with purpose. Well, if it isn't the famous Margaret," he sneered, leaning against the counter with a mocking grin. "I hear people rave about your peach cobbler, but it smells like every other place in this boring town to me." Margaret looked up from the coffee pot she was filling, her expression calm, though her eyes held a quiet resolve. "Good morning, Tommy," she said, her voice steady and kind. "What can I get for you today?" His smirk faltered for a moment, caught off guard by her unfazed response. But he quickly recovered, glancing around the room at the other patrons. "I don't know," he said loudly. "What's the cheapest thing you've got? Don't want to waste money on something that's probably burnt." A ripple of unease swept through the cafe. One man at the corner table muttered, "Why does she let him in here?" Another shook his head in disapproval, whispering to his companion, "He's nothing but trouble." Tommy noticed the reactions and seemed to revel in them. He plopped into a chair near the window, kicking it back on two legs and crossing his arms. "Nice place," he said sarcastically. "Real cozy. Too bad the company stinks." Margaret's friends, who often lingered to help her with the morning crowd, exchanged worried glances. "You can't let him stay here," one of them whispered. "He's just going to scare people away." But Margaret simply wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to Tommy's table. "I'll bring you something warm," she said gently, ignoring his earlier comments. "You look like you could use it." Tommy scoffed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, confusion, maybe even curiosity, as the tension simmered. The cafe seemed to split into factions. Some of the patrons began to argue quietly among themselves. "She's too soft on him," one said. "If he doesn't face consequences, he'll never change." Others, however, saw beyond the surface. "He's just a kid," an older woman murmured. "Who knows what he's dealing with at home?" That evening, after the cafe had closed and the last crumbs were swept away, Margaret sat alone by the window, the day's events playing over in her mind. Tommy's anger, his harsh words. They reminded her of someone she used to know. In the quiet of the empty cafe, memories surfaced, unbidden yet vivid. She was 9 years old again, standing in the schoolyard with her lunchbox clutched tightly in her hands. A group of children circled her, their voices cruel and mocking. They teased her about her skin, her hair, the way she spoke. They called her names that burned into her memory like scars. She had cried that day, but it wasn't the last time. There were years of moments like that, of pain and loneliness, of feeling unseen and unworthy. But Margaret had survived, and in doing so, she had learned how to see the world differently. Tommy's pain wasn't unfamiliar to her. She recognized it in the way he lashed out, in the walls he built around himself. And while the others saw only the trouble he caused, Margaret saw something more. A boy searching for a way to heal wounds he didn't know how to name. The stage was set for a battle of wills, not of anger but of compassion. Margaret resolved to keep her cafe open to Tommy, to face the storm he carried and find a way to reach him, just as someone once had for her. The cafe had never felt so empty. The familiar hum of voices and clatter of dishes had faded over the days, replaced by a stillness that settled heavy in the air. Margaret noticed each absent face, the customers who had stopped coming after Tommy's frequent outbursts. Her regulars, her friends, they didn't understand why she kept letting him in. Tommy, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the silence he had created. He continued to arrive daily, slumping into his usual chair by the window, sometimes muttering sarcastic remarks about the cafe's decor or its patrons. Margaret, ever patient, greeted him with the same gentle warmth as before, but her attempts to engage him in conversation met with cold indifference. One afternoon, she set a slice of her famous peach cobbler in front of him, accompanied by a steaming cup of coffee. "I thought you might like to try this," she said, her voice kind but firm. Tommy barely looked up. "Not interested," he mumbled, shoving the plate aside. Margaret sat across from him, her hands folded neatly on the table. "You remind me of someone I used to know," she began, her tone thoughtful. "Yeah? Well, I don't care," Tommy snapped, cutting her off. The doorbell chimed as another customer left in a hurry, casting a disapproving glance at Tommy on their way out. Margaret sighed softly but didn't respond to his remark. Instead, she busied herself behind the counter, her mind heavy with worry. Later that day, as the cafe remained quiet, a young woman came in, her eyes red from crying. Margaret greeted her with a warm hug, guiding her to a corner table. "It's going to be okay," she murmured, her voice carrying across the room as Tommy sat nearby, pretending not to listen. "I know what it's like to feel like the world is against you, but you're stronger than you realize." You just have to hold on. Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Her words struck a chord he wasn't prepared to face. He glanced at Margaret as she comforted the woman, her presence calm and unwavering. For the first time, he found himself wondering what had made her this way. So kind, so understanding. But the moment passed quickly, and Tommy buried the unsettling feeling under his usual bravado. As the evening wore on, Tommy stood up to leave, knocking his chair back carelessly. His shoulder brushed against a freestanding shelf filled with knickknacks, causing it to wobble. Before he could steady it, the shelf tipped over, sending its contents crashing to the floor. Margaret turned sharply at the sound. Among the shattered items was a small porcelain vase, its delicate floral design now scattered in pieces. Tommy froze, his face pale as he stared at the mess he had caused. That vase, he stammered, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Margaret walked over, her expression calm, but tinged with sadness. She knelt down, carefully gathering the broken shards. "It was my mother's," she said softly, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up a larger piece. Tommy shifted on his feet, guilt written all over his face. I didn't mean to." "I know," Margaret replied, her voice steady. She stood, holding the pieces in her hands. "Accidents happen, Tommy. What matters is how we choose to move forward." Her reaction was unexpected, disarming him completely. There was no anger, no blame, just a quiet acceptance that seemed to cut deeper than any harsh words could have. Tommy stood there, rooted in place, his bravado stripped away. He didn't know how to respond, and for the first time, he couldn't hide the conflict in his eyes. As Margaret turned to clean up the rest of the mess, Tommy lingered by the door, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with something hesitant, almost vulnerable. Without a word, he left the cafe, the bell jingling faintly as the door closed behind him. Margaret watched him go, her expression unreadable. She couldn't be sure if her patience was getting through to him, or if she was only pushing him further away. But as she placed the shattered vase on the counter, she allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. The days that followed were quieter than usual at Margaret's cafe, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. The once bustling tables now sat empty, save for a few steadfast regulars who believed in Margaret's unwavering kindness. The absence of familiar faces weighed heavily on her, but she kept her resolve. Tommy continued his routine of showing up, sometimes lingering by the window, other times slouching in his usual chair. His behavior hadn't improved. In fact, his outbursts grew sharper, as though testing how far Margaret's patience could stretch. Yet, she never wavered. Margaret had taken to leaving small notes for Tommy when he wasn't looking. She'd slipped them under his coffee cup, or tucked them into the paper sleeve of his to-go cup. The notes were simple but heartfelt. Asterisk, you're stronger than you think. Asterisk, asterisk, kindness is a choice, and it's never too late to start. Asterisk, asterisk, you matter. Asterisk. At first, Tommy scoffed, crumpling the notes and tossing them into the trash. But each time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Confusion, maybe even longing. He didn't understand why she bothered, why she insisted on showing him kindness when he gave her nothing but grief in return. One evening, after the cafe had closed, Margaret prepared a warm meal and placed it in a takeout box. When Tommy showed up the next day, she handed it to him without a word. He stared at it for a long moment before muttering, "I don't need your charity." "It's not charity," Margaret replied gently. "It's a meal. Everyone deserves a little warmth now." And then Tommy took the box reluctantly, his fingers gripping it tightly as if unsure whether to accept or throw it away. But beneath his tough exterior, something was beginning to shift. The notes and the meal stirred memories he'd tried to bury, memories of a childhood marked by loss and abandonment. He thought of the nights he'd gone to bed hungry, the times he'd waited by the window for a parent who never came back. Those memories burned like an old wound reopening, and instead of confronting them, he lashed out. One morning, as Margaret was greeting a customer, Tommy slammed his chair against the table. Why do you keep pretending to care? He snapped, his voice echoing through the nearly empty cafe. The customer, startled, quickly paid and left. Margaret turned to Tommy, her expression calm but firm. I'm not pretending, Tommy, she said. I care because you deserve to be cared for, even if you don't believe it. Her words only seemed to fuel his anger. You don't know anything about me, he growled. Stop acting like you're some kind of saint. As he stormed out, the cafe felt emptier than ever. Margaret's heart ached, not just for Tommy, but for the community that was slipping away. Her business was suffering, with fewer customers each day. Friends who had once supported her now avoided the cafe, unable to understand why she tolerated Tommy's behavior. You're risking everything for someone who doesn't even want your help, one of her friends told her. How much longer can you keep this up? Margaret didn't have an answer. The strain was evident, not just financially, but emotionally. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to give up on Tommy. She saw a brokenness in him that reminded her of the struggles she had faced, the pain she had endured. In the solitude of her empty cafe, Margaret clung to hope. She believed that even the hardest hearts could soften, that even the most lost souls could find their way. But as Tommy's anger grew and her cafe's future became more uncertain, doubt began to creep in. The challenges were mounting, and Margaret found herself at a crossroads. Could she hold on to her faith and kindness, or would the weight of her struggles force her to let go? The answer, she knew, lay not just in Tommy's hands, but in her own determination to see the light in the darkest of places. The cafe felt a little less lonely whenever Claire was around. Margaret's young assistant, with her bright eyes and quick smile, had been a constant source of support during the long days of dwindling business. Claire was practical, hard-working, and fiercely loyal to Margaret. But even she struggled to understand her boss's unwavering kindness toward Tommy. Margaret, Claire said one morning as they prepped for the day, her voice hesitant. I know you mean well, but I just don't get it. Tommy's trouble. Why keep giving him chances when he clearly doesn't want them? Margaret looked up from the dough she was kneading, her hands coated in flour. Because I see more in him than what he shows the world, she said softly. Sometimes, the people who push us away the hardest are the ones who need us the most. Claire frowned but didn't press further. She admired Margaret's heart, even if she couldn't fully share her faith in Tommy. The cafe had another regular who had been watching Tommy's antics with keen interest. Mr. Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher who had been frequenting Margaret's for years. The elderly man, with his neatly pressed sweater vest and ever-present crossword puzzle, was known for his sharp mind and quiet wisdom. Unlike many of the other patrons, Mr. Jenkins wasn't quick to judge Tommy. Margaret, he said one afternoon, leaning on his cane as he approached the counter. That boy reminds me of some of the kids I taught back in the day. Angry at the world, sure. But that kind of anger always comes from somewhere. Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. I've been trying to figure out where, but he's not exactly eager to talk. Mr. Jenkins chuckled. Patience, my dear. If there's one thing I learned in all my years of teaching, it's that trust takes time. And sometimes it takes a little push. The push came sooner than expected. One evening, as Claire was tidying up the counter, Tommy stormed in, slamming the door so hard the bell above it nearly fell off. His face was set in a scowl and the tension in the room was palpable. Hey, watch it! Claire snapped, her nerves already frayed from a long day. Tommy shot her a glare. What's your problem? He spat. My problem? Claire threw the towel. She was holding on to the counter. My problem is you coming in here every day and acting like the world owes you something. Margaret stepped out of the kitchen just as Tommy's voice rose. You don't know anything about me, so why don't you keep your mouth shut? Why don't you leave? Claire shot back, her face red with frustration. Enough! Margaret's voice cut to the argument, firm and commanding. Both Claire and Tommy fell silent, but the damage had been done. Claire turned to Margaret, her eyes welling up with tears. I can't do this anymore, she said, her voice trembling. I'm sorry, Margaret, but I I can't. Margaret reached out, but Claire stepped back, shaking her head. You're a good person, but this is too much. Without another word, she grabbed her things and walked out, leaving the cafe eerily quiet. Tommy stood there, looking uncharacteristically unsure of himself. For a moment, it seemed like he might apologize, but instead he muttered, "Whatever," and walked out the door. Margaret watched him leave, her heart heavy. She sat down at one of the empty tables, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. The cafe had lost more than just an employee. Claire had been her confidant, her anchor on tough days. Later that night, Mr. Jenkins stayed behind, helping Margaret close up. "Tough day," he said quietly, his weathered hands stacking chairs. Margaret nodded, her eyes distant. "Claire told me something before she left," she murmured. "About Tommy." Mr. Jenkins looked up, waiting. "His father left when he was a kid," Margaret continued. "He's been on his own ever since. No wonder he's so angry." Mr. Jenkins sighed, his face etched with understanding. "That kind of hurt doesn't go away easily. But you're doing the right thing, Margaret. He just doesn't know it yet." Margaret wasn't so sure. The challenges seemed insurmountable. The cafe emptier than ever, and her faith in her approach wavering. But as she locked up for the night, a quiet voice in her heart reminded her of why she had started this journey. To be the light for someone who had only known darkness. The tension in the cafe had reached a breaking point. The quiet hum of Margaret's once thriving business was now replaced by an unsettling stillness that hung in the air. Each day felt like a battle, and yet Margaret couldn't bring herself to give up on Tommy. The absence of Claire, who had become like a daughter to her, left a hollow space, but the ache in her heart paled in comparison to her growing concern for Tommy. Margaret had tried every approach, every small gesture of kindness, but nothing seemed to reach him. She had been patient, understanding, and steadfast in her belief that he could change. Yet, despite everything, Tommy remained a wall of bitterness and anger, lashing out at anyone who dared to show him compassion. Margaret knew it was time for a different approach. It was time to face him head-on. One evening, as the last customer trickled out, Margaret approached Tommy, who was hunched over a cup of coffee, staring into the depths of the steaming liquid. The usual tension in the air had settled into an awkward quietness. This time, Margaret didn't wait for him to speak. She took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say what she had been holding back for so long. "Tommy," she said, her voice calm but firm. He didn't respond, but his shoulders stiffened. "I want to talk to you." Tommy's eyes flickered up, but he said nothing. Margaret sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. "I've watched you for weeks now," she began, her tone quiet, measured. "And I've been trying to understand you. But I think I've been going about it all wrong." She paused, her gaze softening as she searched for the right words. "I know what it feels like to be angry, to feel like the world has turned its back on you. I know what it's like to be misunderstood, to have people judge you without knowing your story." Tommy scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, whatever," he muttered, clearly uninterested. But Margaret didn't falter. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "When I was young," she continued, "I was bullied, ignored, and looked down upon. People saw the color of my skin before they saw me, and that made everything harder. But I didn't let that define me. I had to learn to forgive, to let go of the pain, because holding on to it only kept me trapped in a cycle of anger. And that's the hardest thing I've ever done." Tommy's gaze wavered for just a moment, but he quickly looked away, his jaw clenched. "So what? You want me to just forget everything and be like you?" His voice was sharp, defensive. "No," Margaret replied softly. "I'm not asking you to forget, but I am asking you to stop carrying all that weight. You don't have to let it control you, and you don't have to do it alone." Her words hung in the air, charged with an unspoken understanding. Tommy stared at her for a long moment, the walls around him seeming to crack, just a little. "I'm not like you, Margaret," Tommy finally said, his voice low, filled with frustration. "You don't get it. I don't want your pity. And I don't need your help." Margaret sighed, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She stood slowly, moving to the counter. But before she turned away, she spoke one last time. "I'm not trying to change you, Tommy. I'm just trying to show you that there's another way." Without another word, Tommy stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Margaret stood there, watching him leave, the finality of the moment sinking in. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. She had tried to break through the armor he had built around himself. And though he hadn't accepted it, she knew that the seed had been planted. Hours passed. The cafe was empty, and the silence felt suffocating. Margaret cleaned the counter, her movements automatic, her mind still replaying her conversation with Tommy. As she wiped down the table where he had been sitting, she noticed something, a small piece of paper tucked into the sleeve of Tommy's jacket. She picked it up, recognizing it instantly. It was one of the notes she had written for him. But this one was different. It wasn't one of the simple, encouraging messages she had left on his cup. This one had been folded neatly, and as she unfolded it, she read the words carefully. Asterisk, "I don't know if you'll ever understand this, but I'm not giving up on you. You are worthy of love, Tommy. You are worthy of redemption, and you don't have to be the person you think you are. You can be more, and I'll be here when you're ready to believe that." Asterisk. The note trembled slightly in her hands as she read it again, the weight of her own words settling in her chest. She couldn't help the small, bittersweet smile that crept onto her face. Tommy had kept it. He had kept the note. And for the first time, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the walls around Tommy's heart were starting to crumble. The next few days were filled with an uneasy calm. Margaret's cafe remained quiet, the once bustling tables now mostly empty, save for a few patrons who still believed in the magic of her warmth. But there was something different in the air. Margaret had learned to live with the absence of Claire, though it stung deeply. Her heart, however, was lighter in one unexpected way. Tommy's letter. The small piece of paper had changed something in her. The hope that she had quietly clung to for so long had found a spark. That evening, after closing, Margaret sat at the back of the cafe, surrounded by the comforting smell of freshly baked bread. The cafe's warmth had been a part of her life for so long, a home that had offered solace not only to her, but to everyone who stepped through its doors. She had hoped for a long time that Tommy would return, that he would come to understand her words and let them settle in his heart. She had offered him kindness, but the offer in her letter went deeper. It was an invitation to something far more than just the occasional free meal. Tommy hadn't come back for days, and Margaret worried that the chance was lost. But then, just as she was about to close for the night, a shadow appeared at the door. Tommy stood there, looking awkward and unsure, as if the threshold of the cafe was a battleground in itself. Margaret met his gaze, her eyes steady and calm. "Can I help you?" she asked softly, her voice welcoming but not pressing. I got your letter," Tommy muttered, his voice a mixture of frustration and something else, something that almost resembled vulnerability. It made me think." He paused for a moment, glancing down at the floor as though ashamed of whatever words were coming next. "I want to learn." Margaret didn't rush in to speak. She simply nodded, waiting for him to continue. "Learn what?" she asked gently. Tommy shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against his jeans. "Learn how to bake." He looked up at her, as if testing her reaction. You said I could learn. So, here I am." For a moment, Margaret simply smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting with quiet pride. Tommy's walls were still there, but they were beginning to show cracks. "All right then," she said, her voice steady. "Let's start." The days that followed were slower than usual, but the air in the cafe seemed to change. Tommy returned every morning, dragging himself in with a gruff reluctance that slowly melted away as he became more comfortable in the kitchen. At first, he struggled with the dough, the flour slipping through his fingers, the measuring cups feeling foreign in his hands. He would snap at himself, muttering curses under his breath. But Margaret was patient. She never raised her voice or grew frustrated. Instead, she calmly showed him again and again and again. It wasn't easy, but gradually, Tommy began to find a rhythm. There was something about the precise measurements, the feel of the dough between his hands, that gave him a sense of control. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about the anger that had once consumed him. The rhythmic kneading, the steady focus on the task at hand, was a form of therapy, a way to release the tension that had always lived inside him. At first, Tommy's interactions with the cafe's customers remained distant. He would barely look up when they came in, too focused on his work. But over time, something remarkable began to happen. He started to observe. He began to see the people around him not as annoyances or obstacles, but as individuals, people with their own stories. There was Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who always sat by the window, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Tommy overheard her one morning, speaking to Margaret about the loss of her husband years ago, and how she came to the cafe for comfort on days when the silence in her house became too much to bear. Tommy found himself listening, something unfamiliar stirring inside him. Then there was Mr. Jenkins, the elderly man who had always insisted on paying an exact change, no matter how small the bill. Tommy had watched him for weeks, thinking he was just another cranky old man. But one afternoon, as he passed by the counter, he overheard Mr. Jenkins telling Margaret about his late wife, how they used to bake together every Sunday, a tradition they had started in their youth. The way Mr. Jenkins spoke of her, the love still evident in his voice, struck Tommy deeply. Tommy's once harsh exterior began to soften. He realized that everyone in the cafe was carrying something that made them who they were. Mrs. Patterson's loneliness, Mr. Jenkins's grief, and even Margaret's own quiet strength in the face of so much loss. It was all a part of their stories. One morning, as he was pulling a batch of croissants from the oven, Tommy caught himself smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time in what felt like forever. The warmth of the kitchen, the scent of the freshly baked pastries, and the quiet camaraderie of the cafe patrons had created something within him he hadn't known he was missing. He looked up and caught Margaret's eye. She was standing near the counter, watching him with a proud smile on her face. Tommy didn't say anything at first. There were no words needed. He simply gave her a small nod, acknowledging the unspoken bond that had begun to form between them. But it wasn't just the baking that was changing him. It was Margaret's patient guidance, the way she refused to give up on him, no matter how many times he stumbled. It was the understanding that redemption wasn't a one-time event. It was a process. And for the first time in a long while, Tommy felt like he had a place where he could belong. As the days passed, the cafe grew busier again, slowly but surely. The community, once divided by Tommy's presence, was starting to come together. The tension in the air began to lift, replaced by the comforting hum of conversations and laughter that had once filled these walls. And as Tommy continued to learn, continued to grow, Margaret knew that this was just the beginning of something even more profound. Tommy had found his way, not just through the art of baking, but through the understanding that every person, no matter how rough or broken, had the potential to heal. And Margaret's unwavering belief in him had been the catalyst for that change. Margaret watched Tommy as he carefully rolled the dough, his brow furrowed in concentration. The day's sunlight streamed through the windows of the cafe, casting a warm glow on the kitchen, but there was still a sense of tension hanging in the air. It wasn't just the pressure of perfecting the pastries, or the silent expectations from the customers who had slowly started returning. No, it was the weight of Tommy's past, the invisible burden he carried, that seemed to linger in every corner of the cafe. Tommy had come a long way since his first reluctant step into the kitchen, but Margaret knew that the hardest part of his journey was yet to come. It wasn't about the baking anymore. It was about confronting the pain he had buried deep inside himself. The anger, the mistrust, the walls that kept him from reaching out. "You're doing well," Margaret said, her voice calm and encouraging. She stood at his side, watching as he meticulously shaped the dough. "You've got the hang of it. Just don't rush it." Tommy didn't respond at first, his focus solely on the task at hand. But there was a subtle shift in his posture, a softening of his rigid frame. Margaret could see the struggle in his eyes, the frustration that came with every mistake, every imperfect loaf. She could tell that every failure, no matter how small, was a reminder of the disappointments he had suffered throughout his life. But Margaret wasn't going to let him quit. Not now. She had seen the potential in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. "It's okay to mess up," she continued, offering him a gentle smile. "That's part of the process. You can't get better without a few mistakes along the way." Tommy let out a frustrated sigh, slamming the dough onto the countertop with a little too much force. "I can't get this right," he muttered, his voice low, tinged with the anger he still struggled to control. Margaret took a step closer, her voice steady but full of warmth. "You're not failing, Tommy. You're learning, and that's something to be proud of." He hesitated, his eyes flickering with doubt, but Margaret didn't back down. She had learned the hard way that persistence was key, and she wasn't about to let Tommy give up on himself. "It's about more than just the baking," she added quietly. "It's about trusting yourself. You have a chance to be better, to move past what's been holding you back. Don't waste that." Tommy met her gaze, his expression softening ever so slightly. For the first time in a while, he wasn't dismissing her words. There was a flicker of something there, a hint of belief. But as the days went on, there was still something unsettled beneath the surface. Margaret knew that Tommy's internal battles were far from over. The anger, the fear, the uncertainty. It wasn't something that could be fixed in a few baking lessons. Tommy needed more than just guidance in the kitchen. He needed someone to truly see him, to understand the pain that fueled his hostility. And as much as she wished she could be that person, Margaret knew that Tommy needed to confront his past in order to truly move forward. That's when Claire came into the picture. After Tommy had started to show improvement, Margaret's hope began to grow. She knew that the cafe's success was intertwined with Tommy's progress. But the space that Claire had left behind still weighed heavily on her heart. Claire had been more than just an assistant. She had been her confidant, her support when times got tough. But after the confrontation with Tommy, Claire had left in frustration, unsure of how to reconcile with the troubled teenager. Margaret had tried to respect Claire's decision to leave. But deep down, she knew that it wasn't over. Claire had a place in this cafe. She had a bond with Margaret that couldn't be replaced by anyone else. So, after much consideration, Margaret decided to reach out. One rainy afternoon, as the cafe emptied out for the evening, Margaret took a deep breath and picked up the phone. It rang twice before Claire's voice answered, tinged with surprise but also an edge of reluctance. "Claire, it's Margaret," she began softly. "I know things have been hard, but I need you to know that I've been thinking a lot. Tommy, he's trying, and I need you here. Not just for me, but for him too." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Margaret thought Claire might hang up. But then Claire spoke, her voice softer than it had been in weeks. "I don't know, Margaret. I don't know if I can just go back there. After everything he said." "I understand," Margaret replied, her tone filled with empathy. "But I need you to see the person he's becoming. He's struggling, Claire, but I think he deserves another chance. And maybe, just maybe, you can help him see that too." The line was silent for a long moment before Claire finally sighed. "I'll come by tomorrow, but only for you, Margaret." The next morning, Claire walked into the cafe, her presence still familiar, but tinged with a wariness that couldn't be shaken so easily. Tommy was in the kitchen, working silently, as usual. When he saw Claire, his expression immediately hardened, as if anticipating another confrontation. But Margaret had already talked to him. She had prepared him for the possibility of Claire's return, explaining that healing was a two-way street. Claire hesitated, standing just inside the doorway for a moment, watching Tommy with a mixture of frustration and compassion. Then, slowly, she walked toward the counter, her eyes never leaving him. Tommy didn't move at first, but the air between them shifted. The tension was palpable. "Look, I know I didn't make things easy for you," Claire said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "But I can't keep running away from it. If you're really trying, I want to see it. I just need to know you're willing to meet me halfway." Tommy met her gaze for a moment, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and uncertainty. Then, after a long silence, he spoke in a low voice. "I'm trying. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the beginning of a new understanding, a new chance for both Tommy and Claire to rebuild the trust that had been shattered." As Tommy's baking skills improved day by day, he began to slowly open up to both Margaret and Claire. His tough exterior was beginning to crack, and with each passing conversation, the walls around his heart grew a little thinner. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the kitchen, Tommy finally spoke, his voice shaky but sincere. "I'm afraid," he admitted, his eyes downcast. "Afraid that if I let people in, they'll just leave again. I'm afraid of being rejected, of not being good enough." Margaret set down the pastry she was working on and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are good enough, Tommy," she said quietly, "and I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, Tommy believed her. Tommy's transformation had been slow but steady. Each day he spent in the cafe, each loaf of bread, each batch of cookies, brought him closer to the person he could become, the person Margaret had always believed in. There was still a lingering shadow behind his eyes, a residue of old wounds, but it was becoming harder to ignore the change that was unfolding before his very eyes. The cafe, once teetering on the edge of closing, was regaining its warmth, the familiar hum of conversation once again filling the air. The patrons who had drifted away were slowly returning, drawn not just by Margaret's charm, but by the subtle shift in the energy of the place. It had always been a refuge for the troubled, the lonely, and the broken, but now it was becoming a sanctuary of healing for everyone who stepped through its doors. Tommy's skills in the kitchen had grown, and his confidence had begun to catch up. He still had moments of doubt, of fear, of those old demons from his past clawing at the edges of his resolve. But it was in moments like this that Margaret saw the full scope of his potential. It happened on a late afternoon, as the cafe was nearing closing time. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the wooden floors, when a group of teenagers entered the cafe. They were loud, brash, and completely unaware of the presence of the elderly patrons who had settled at their usual spots. Tommy had seen them before. Teenagers who thought they owned the world, whose laughter was sharp, almost cruel. This time, they had turned their attention to Mr. Jenkins, the elderly man who often sat by the window, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper in his usual quiet manner. One of the boys, tall and brimming with arrogance, made a remark about Mr. Jenkins being a fossil, and the group burst into mocking laughter. Tommy froze. For a split second, he thought of turning away, letting the moment pass. It would have been easier that way, but something inside him snapped, a recognition of how it felt to be belittled, to be the target of ridicule. Without thinking, he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Hey!" Tommy's voice, though not loud, carried an authority that surprised even him. The group of teenagers turned to look at him, momentarily taken aback by his sudden outburst. "That's not funny," he added, his tone calm but firm. The leader of the group sneered, obviously not used to being challenged. "What's your problem?" he asked, the words dripping with disdain. "My problem is you." Tommy's eyes locked with his stance unwavering. "Mr. Jenkins is a person, not a joke. Show some respect." His voice remained steady, but the raw emotion underneath was evident. He had seen too much of the world's cruelty, too much of the anger that burned inside him from years of neglect. And now, he was finally in a place where he didn't have to hide it. There was a brief moment of silence, a tension hanging in the air as the group of teenagers hesitated. One by one, they slowly shuffled out of the cafe, grumbling under their breath. Tommy stood there, his chest rising and falling with each breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The anger that had once ruled his every decision was still there, but now it was being channeled into something positive. He wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. Not anymore. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and then Mr. Jenkins, who had been silent through the entire exchange, looked up at Tommy. His eyes, usually cloudy with age, gleamed with something else, pride. "You've got a good heart, son," he said softly. "Don't let anyone take that from you." Tommy swallowed hard, the words settling deep within him. For the first time, he realized the strength it took to protect others, to stand up for something bigger than himself. It was a lesson that would stick with him far longer than any batch of pastries ever could. The cafe hummed with a renewed energy after the teens left, the community spirit slowly rebuilding itself. But even in the warmth of the cafe, Tommy could feel the tight knot of self-doubt that continued to plague him. He was getting better, sure, but was he truly worthy of the respect he had just earned? Was he really capable of changing? Or was it just a fleeting moment of courage? As the evening settled in, Margaret watched Tommy from across the room. She could see the exhaustion in his posture, the weariness in his eyes as he wiped down the counter. It was a familiar look, one she had seen in the mirror many times before. She knew that Tommy was still battling the ghosts of his past, those old fears that whispered he wasn't enough. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her own unspoken story. She walked over to Tommy, her movements deliberate, her presence as steady as always. She placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You did well today," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that only Tommy could understand. "You showed more strength in that moment than you realize." Tommy looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I didn't think I had it in me," he admitted, his voice rough. Margaret smiled, but it was tinged with a sadness that she didn't try to hide. She knew all too well what it was like to doubt your own worth. She had lived it, breathing it in every day, especially in the years when she had fought to survive in a world that hadn't always been kind to her. But it was in the quiet sacrifices she had made, the quiet decisions to stay when everything told her to leave, that she had found her true strength. And it was time for Tommy to understand that strength too. "You don't have to be perfect, Tommy," she said, her voice steady and calm. "But you do have to believe in yourself. And sometimes that means facing the hard truths." She paused for a moment, looking out the window, her gaze far away. "You see, there was a time when I had to make a sacrifice to help someone I loved. I lost something precious to me, something I thought I could never part with. But I did it because I believed that person needed me more than I needed what I was holding on to." Tommy watched her, confused yet intrigued. Margaret turned back to face him, her eyes filled with both pain and wisdom. "I lost my chance at a family," she continued softly, her voice full of a quiet grief that had never truly healed. "But it was worth it, because that person went on to live a better life. And sometimes, that's what we have to do. We have to let go of what we want in order to help someone else find their way." Tommy felt a lump form in his throat as he processed her words. In that moment, he understood more than just baking. He understood sacrifice and the lengths people would go to for the sake of others. Margaret wasn't just a wise woman running a cafe. She was a symbol of the kind of resilience and love he had always wished for. "You'll find your way, Tommy," Margaret said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "You just have to believe that you're worth it." And for the first time, Tommy felt something stir inside him, a spark of belief that had been buried so deep it almost felt foreign. But as Margaret's words sank in, he realized he wasn't alone. He had someone to stand by him, someone who understood the cost of kindness, someone who had already paid the price. The cafe had become a place of healing, not just for the community, but for Tommy too. And as he stood there, the weight of his past finally beginning to loosen, he realized that it wasn't about getting it perfect. It was about moving forward, one small step at a time. And that, he realized, was enough. The day of the community event arrived with a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Margaret had worked tirelessly to prepare the cafe for the celebration, setting up decorations, arranging tables, and ensuring that the atmosphere would reflect the warmth and love that had started to flow back into the place. It wasn't just any event. It was a chance for Tommy to show everyone how much he had grown. It was his opportunity to finally step into the light, to step up and demonstrate the transformation that had taken place, not just in his baking, but in his heart. The cafe was filled with familiar faces, the elderly patrons, the couples who had been married for decades, the young families, and the children who had learned to appreciate the simple joy of a well-made pastry. But today, there was a new sense of unity, of people coming together in support of one another. The air was thick with warmth, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Tommy stood behind the counter, focused and determined, carefully crafting delicate pastries and bread with a precision that seemed almost effortless. He had come a long way since that first day he had set foot in the cafe. The tough exterior he once wore like armor had slowly cracked, revealing a young man who was capable of more than just anger and defiance. As he worked, his hands steady and sure, he glanced around the room, catching sight of Claire, who had returned to the cafe not long ago. She was standing by the counter, her arms folded, but her expression was softer than it had been in weeks. Tommy met her gaze, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. He had spent so much of his life running from the things that scared him. His father's abandonment, the years of neglect, the anger he had carried inside. But today, standing here, he finally felt like he was in control of his own story. The past no longer defined him, and as much as he had feared it, today was the day he was going to make things right. Taking a deep breath, Tommy walked over to where Claire stood, his steps hesitant but determined. The noise of the cafe seemed to fade into the background, and in that quiet moment, all that mattered was the apology he was about to offer. "Claire," he began, his voice low but clear. She looked up at him, her expression neutral, though there was a flicker of something softer in her eyes. "I owe you an apology. For everything I said, for everything I did. I was wrong, and I've been thinking about it. I know I hurt you. I'm sorry." For a few seconds, Claire didn't say anything. She simply studied him, her gaze searching for something, an indication that his words were genuine, that this wasn't just another empty apology. Tommy held her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. The vulnerability of the moment was almost unbearable, but he knew he had to face it. Finally, Claire sighed, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "I've seen the change in you, Tommy," she said quietly, her voice tinged with both caution and relief. "And I believe you, but it's going to take time. I'm not going to just forget everything overnight." "I know," Tommy responded, nodding earnestly. "But I'll keep proving it every day." Claire studied him for a moment longer before offering a small, tentative smile. "Then I'll be here. I'm willing to give you that chance." Tommy felt a weight lift off his shoulders as she spoke, but before he could fully process the relief that washed over him, a voice interrupted the quiet moment. Tommy, his heart froze at the sound of that voice, low, gravelly, and familiar in all the wrong ways. Tommy turned slowly, his body stiffening as he faced a man who had abandoned him years ago. His father, standing at the entrance of the cafe, looking as cold and distant as Tommy remembered, was the man who had never once fought for him, the man who had left him to fend for himself. The room seemed to go silent, the air thick with tension. Tommy's hands clenched into fists, his pulse racing. He could feel every pair of eyes in the cafe on him, watching him as the walls he had so carefully built around his emotions began to crumble. His father stepped into the room, his presence almost suffocating. He wasn't there to apologize. Tommy knew that much. He was here for something else, something Tommy couldn't quite place. "Dad," Tommy muttered, his voice tight with anger and disbelief. "What are you doing here?" The older man looked around the cafe, his gaze sweeping over the patrons who had once been like family to Tommy. Then, His eyes landed on his son. "I heard you were doing well for yourself," he said gruffly, his tone laced with a mixture of disdain and something else, perhaps pride, though Tommy couldn't tell. "Looks like this little place has worked some magic on you." Tommy's stomach twisted with a mixture of rage and hurt. The fact that his father was standing here now, in this cafe, talking about magic, as if it was some small thing, some minor detail in Tommy's life, only deepened the wound that had never healed. "This place is more than just magic," Tommy shot back, his voice thick with emotion. "This place gave me a chance when no one else did. It gave me something to fight for. But you," he stopped, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "You're the one who left. You're the reason I've been broken all these years." The cafe was dead silent now, every eye on Tommy and his father. Margaret watched from the back of the room, her heart aching for Tommy. She could see the battle within him, the rage, the hurt, the fear of rejection. She knew this moment was a test, one that would determine whether Tommy would break under the weight of his past or rise above it. Tommy's father took a step forward, his face unreadable. "I didn't ask for this, Tommy. I didn't ask for you to make me feel guilty for what happened. You never asked for anything." Tommy's voice cracked with the rawness of his emotions. "You never cared enough to even try." There was a long, tense pause, and for a moment, Tommy thought his father might turn and walk away. But then something unexpected happened. I don't know how to fix this, son," his father said quietly, his voice rough with something that almost sounded like regret. "But I'm here, and maybe that's a start." The words hit Tommy like a punch to the gut. He wasn't sure what to feel. Anger, relief, disappointment. He wanted to yell at him, to tell him that it was too late, that there was nothing his father could do to fix the years of neglect and pain. But instead, he felt something else, something he hadn't expected. Hope. Tommy turned to face the cafe, his chest heavy with the weight of his father's words. The people in the room, the ones who had believed in him when no one else had, were still there. They hadn't left. They had stayed, just like Margaret had. And maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed to start healing. "I don't know what comes next," Tommy said to the room, his voice quieter now, but stronger. "But I'm going to keep trying. And I'm not going to let my past control me anymore." The cafe erupted in applause, not just for his words, but for the man he had become. As Tommy stood there, amidst the love and warmth of the community he had fought so hard to build, he realized that the real test wasn't whether his father could fix their relationship. It was whether he could fix himself. And he was ready. As the last echoes of applause faded, the tension in the cafe seemed to dissipate, leaving behind an air of cautious hope. Tommy stood at the center of the room, the weight of his father's unexpected words still settling in his chest. He was no longer the angry, defiant young man who had first walked into Margaret's cafe months ago. In that moment, Tommy felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet acceptance that he couldn't undo his past, but he could shape his future. He could choose to move forward, no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be. Margaret watched him with a quiet pride, her heart swelling with the understanding that this moment wasn't just about Tommy's transformation. It was also about her own journey of forgiveness and healing. She had spent so many years quietly bearing the weight of her own past, her own hurt. But in helping Tommy, she had rediscovered the power of letting go and trusting that people could change. Tommy's father, still standing near the door, seemed unsure of what to do next. His words had been raw, vulnerable, but he still didn't know how to bridge the gap between him and his son. Margaret stepped forward, her gaze steady and knowing. She had witnessed Tommy's evolution over the past few months, and she had seen the cracks begin to form in his father's tough exterior. "Tommy's right," Margaret said gently, her voice carrying the wisdom of a woman who had lived through countless struggles herself. "It's not enough to just show up. You have to show that you're willing to listen, to understand, to make amends." She looked at Tommy's father, her eyes soft but unwavering. "And it's never too late to start." Tommy turned to look at Margaret, his eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. The words she spoke were powerful, But he wasn't sure he was ready to face everything that would come next. He had always felt abandoned, left to navigate the world without the guidance of a father, but Margaret had shown him that there were other ways to find strength, through community, through the connections we build, and through the kindness of people who choose to stay. His father, still processing Margaret's words, seemed to deflate slightly. The rough exterior he had maintained for so long cracked, revealing a man who had carried guilt and regret for years. "I don't know if I can ever make up for the things I've done," he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "But I'm here. I want to try. For you, Tommy." He glanced at the young man, his expression weary but sincere. Tommy looked at his father, a mix of emotions swirling within him. For so long, he had built up walls around his heart, unwilling to let anyone close. But Margaret had shown him the importance of opening up, of letting people in, even when it seemed impossible. His father's apology wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It was a first step in a long, uncertain path toward healing. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the tumult of emotions within him. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see what happens next." He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly, but his resolve firm. "That's all I can give you right now. A chance. A chance to prove that you're really here." The room was silent as everyone watched this quiet exchange between father and son. Tommy's words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of hurt, of years spent searching for answers that had never come. And yet, in that moment, there was something powerful in his willingness to try, to face the past, to confront the pain, and to take the first steps towards something better. Margaret smiled softly, her heart full of pride for both of them. She knew that forgiveness wasn't an easy road, and it wasn't always a straight path. But it was a choice to let go of the bitterness, to free oneself from the shackles of the past. She had made that choice long ago, and now, Tommy was making it too. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Margaret said quietly, her words carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. "It means choosing to move forward, even when the past still hurts. It means letting go of the anger that holds you back and finding peace in the present." Tommy's father nodded slowly, absorbing Margaret's words. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'll keep trying." The moment hung in the air, heavy with the potential for change, for growth, for the possibility of reconciliation. Tommy wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew that the café had given him something he had never expected, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, and a glimpse of the man he could become. As the evening wore on, the café began to fill with warmth once again. The patrons who had been hesitant to return, unsure of what to expect, began trickling back in. They watched as Tommy served pastries with a quiet pride, as he interacted with the customers who had once been strangers, and as he slowly but surely became part of the community that had once felt so distant. Margaret's heart swelled with a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about Tommy's redemption. It was about the power of community, of people coming together to support one another, to lift each other up in times of struggle. And in that moment, she knew that the café had become more than just a place to eat and drink. It had become a symbol of hope, of second chances, of the belief that no one was beyond redemption. In the days that followed, Tommy's relationship with his father remained tentative, but the foundation for healing had been laid. They began taking small steps toward rebuilding their connection, one conversation at a time. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but Tommy knew that the road to forgiveness was never linear. It was a journey, and he was willing to take it one step at a time. And as for Margaret, she continued to guide Tommy with her wisdom and her unwavering belief in the power of love, community, and second chances. She knew that the true measure of success wasn't in the pastries they baked or the coffee they served. It was in the hearts they touched, the lives they changed, and the hope they inspired. The town saw that, too. They saw the strength it took to forgive, the courage it took to change, and the power of a community that refused to give up on one another. And in that, they all found something to believe in, a belief in redemption, in healing, and in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. As the weeks passed, the transformation in Tommy became even more evident. What had once been a young man filled with anger and uncertainty was now a reliable and confident presence in the cafe. He worked alongside Margaret with a sense of purpose, his hands steady as he prepared dishes, served customers, and even experimented with new recipes. The community, once hesitant and divided, began to see him not as the troubled teenager they had once known, but as a part of their extended family. Margaret watched with quiet pride as Tommy's once rough exterior softened into something more familiar, more human. His relationships with the cafe's patrons deepened, and slowly, the warmth that had once been absent in his life began to spread to everyone around him. He still had his moments of doubt, of course. Old habits were hard to break, and the memories of his past would always linger. But he had found something new in the cafe, a sense of belonging, a sense of worth, and a renewed purpose. Tommy no longer just worked at the cafe. He had become its heartbeat. He greeted customers with a smile, offered them kind words of encouragement, and even began helping with community outreach, organizing events that brought people together in the same way Margaret had always done. He learned to listen to people's stories, to empathize with their struggles, and to offer support in the way he had once received it. The cafe, too, began to thrive once more. The shelves that had once stood empty now brimmed with freshly baked goods and warm cups of coffee. The laughter that had been absent for so long returned, filling the cafe with a sense of joy that had seemed lost. Margaret's business had once been on the brink of collapse, but now, with Tommy's help and the support of the community, it was flourishing. The once struggling cafe had become a symbol of resilience, of healing, and of the power of second chances. One evening, as the sun began to set and the soft glow of the cafe's lights filled the room, Tommy approached Margaret as she was cleaning up the counter. She looked up from her work and caught sight of him standing there, his expression soft but determined. "Margaret," Tommy began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you for everything." He paused for a moment, as though searching for the right words. "For giving me a chance when no one else would. For believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. You didn't have to, but you did. And because of you, I found something I never thought I'd have, a home. A place where I'm not just a kid who messed up, but someone who can actually make a difference." Margaret smiled gently, wiping her hands on her apron as she looked up at Tommy. She had seen him go from a troubled, angry young man to someone who was not only capable of change, but someone who was willing to work hard to earn the trust of those around him. It was a journey that had taken time, patience, and understanding, but it had been worth every moment. "You've made all the difference, Tommy," Margaret said softly. "You've taught me just as much as I've taught you. It's never easy to open up, to trust, to forgive. But you've done all those things, and I couldn't be more proud of you." Tommy's eyes glistened with a mixture of gratitude and emotion. He had come to realize that the kindness Margaret had shown him wasn't just about the food or the business. It was about the way she had seen him, really seen him, even when he couldn't see himself. It was her belief in him that had sparked his own belief in change, in redemption, in the possibility of a better future. "You've changed my life, Margaret," Tommy said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't ever repay you for that, but I'm going to try. Every day." Margaret reached out and placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You don't need to repay me, Tommy. The fact that you're here, that you've turned your life around, that's all the reward I need." And in that moment, as the cafe buzzed with the sounds of laughter and the clinking of coffee cups, it became clear that this was more than just a place where people gathered to drink and eat. It was a place where people found redemption, where broken pieces were mended, and where the power of kindness, community, and forgiveness had transformed not only one person's life, but an entire town. Tommy continued to work at the cafe, becoming an integral part of the community. He had found his place in the world, and it was here, alongside Margaret, in the cafe that had given him a second chance. The bonds that had been formed between the townsfolk were stronger than ever, and together, they built something lasting. a community that supported and uplifted one another no matter their pasts. As the seasons changed and time passed, Tommy's transformation continued. He became more confident, more grounded, and more sure of who he was and what he wanted. The cafe was no longer just a business. It was a symbol of hope, a symbol of what could be accomplished when people believed in each other, when they took the time to truly see one another. Margaret, with her wisdom and patience, had given Tommy the tools to heal, to forgive, and to grow. And in return, Tommy had given her something priceless, a reminder of the power of kindness, of the importance of believing in the goodness within people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. As the last customer of the evening left, Tommy stood behind the counter, his hands resting on the warm surface, looking out at the empty cafe. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He had finally found where he belonged, and he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. "Thanks, Margaret," he whispered under his breath, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "I'll never forget what you've done for me." And as the door to the cafe closed behind him, the world outside seemed just a little bit brighter, filled with the promise of second chances, of healing, and of the transformative power of kindness.